My friends, I wish everyone an amazing Friday, but I ask for your attention, and if possible, leave in the comments what you think, because nobody around the Detroit Lions right now is ignoring what is happening during these early OTA sessions, because the first wave of information coming out of Allen Park is already creating serious conversations about how this roster is being built for the upcoming season. And one of the names quietly starting to generate attention inside the building is rookie linebacker Jimmy Rolder. Early reports are already saying that Rolder is making an impact during practices, and for Lions fans, that matters a lot more than people outside Detroit may realize. The reason this is becoming such a big topic is because linebacker depth was one of the biggest concerns surrounding this defense after the departure of Alex Anzalone. There were questions about who would step up, who could bring energy to the middle of the field, and whether Brad Holmes had done enough during the draft to reinforce that area. Now suddenly, only days into OTAs, there are already positive reviews about Rolder learning quickly and adapting fast to the NFL environment. And honestly, this is exactly why so many people inside the fan base were against the idea of Detroit aggressively trading up during the draft. The Lions needed depth everywhere. They needed young contributors, not just one flashy name. If Brad Holmes had forced a massive trade package to move up the board, there is a very real chance Detroit would not have landed multiple players that are now expected to become important pieces of this roster. That is why this entire conversation around the draft strategy is becoming more interesting now. Because while national analysts continue questioning Detroit's aggressive mindset in trade discussions, Lions fans are starting to see why patience may have actually saved this draft class. Derek Moore remains part of the roster because they stayed patient. Keith Abney became another developmental piece because they stayed patient. Jimmy Rolder is now creating buzz because they stayed patient. And the important part here is not whether Rolder becomes an immediate starter in week 1. Nobody is expecting perfection from a rookie linebacker this early. What matters is that he is already showing signs that the coaching staff made the correct evaluation. Malcolm Rodriguez may still open the season as the starter, but if Rolder continues progressing like this, Detroit suddenly has competition, energy, and rotational depth at a position that looked concerning not long ago. At the same time, another major discussion surrounding the Lions right now involves the criticism aimed at Brad Holmes and the organization regarding draft day trade philosophy. Some analysts are warning that Detroit's willingness to explore aggressive trades could eventually backfire if they become too desperate to move up for specific prospects. And technically, that concern is understandable. Every franchise can eventually make a mistake if they force moves unnecessarily. But here is where the conversation gets important for Lions fans. Brad Holmes actually did not panic during this last draft. Detroit explored possibilities. They evaluated opportunities, but when the price became too expensive, they backed away. That matters a lot because it shows discipline. The Lions could have sacrificed valuable draft capital trying to force a move for a prospect higher on the board, but instead they stayed patient and allowed the board to fall naturally. And now the result is a roster with more depth across multiple positions instead of one expensive gamble. That is why many fans are defending Holmes right now, because when you look specifically at his draft history, there is a strong argument that he has earned trust. Not perfection, because no general manager is perfect, but trust. This front office has found impact players through smart drafting decisions that helped completely transform Detroit into a legitimate contender. Even when discussing previous draft trades, the results speak loudly. Brian Branch became a massive success. Sam Laporta became one of the most important offensive weapons on the team. Jahmyr Gibbs changed the explosiveness of the offense immediately. Jameson Williams developed into a dangerous playmaker after patience from the organization. Those moves helped reshape the identity of the Lions. Of course, not every move worked. Broderick Martin gets mentioned as an example of a miss, and that is fair. Every franchise misses on picks sometimes, but Detroit's overall draft success under Brad Holmes has clearly outweighed the failures, and that is why many inside the fan base are not panicking about these outside criticisms regarding draft aggressiveness. Then the conversation shifts toward another major rumor now circulating around the Lions. The possibility of Detroit making a move for Arizona Cardinals pass rusher Josh Sweat. Multiple reports are saying teams are calling Arizona to explore a potential trade, and naturally Detroit's name immediately entered the discussion because the Lions have been connected to pass rush help for years. On paper, Lions fans understand why the idea sounds attractive. Adding another proven edge rusher opposite Aiden Hutchinson could completely elevate this defense. defense. Detroit absolutely wants more pressure packages. They absolutely want more depth on the defensive line. But the financial side of this situation is where things become complicated. Because while the Lions technically could afford Josh Sweat, the bigger issue is long-term roster management. This organization knows massive contracts are approaching. Jahmyr Gibbs will eventually need to be paid. Sam Laporta will eventually need a new deal. Brian Branch is going to command major money in the future. The front office is trying to balance winning now while protecting the future core of this team, and that is why many people inside Detroit believe a trade for Josh Sweat probably will not happen despite the rumors. The Lions may love the player, but sacrificing future flexibility and draft assets becomes much harder when this roster already has several foundational stars approaching contract extensions. At the same time, another controversial discussion is starting to spread around the NFL world. The idea that Detroit should consider trading Terrion Arnold before the 2026 season to recover draft capital. And honestly, that idea is creating frustration among a lot of Lions fans because it feels way too early to even consider giving up on him. Before his injury last season, Terrion Arnold was showing clear signs of improvement. The development was visible, the confidence was growing, and everybody understands that cornerback is one of the hardest positions in football for young players. Many defensive backs take years before making a massive leap. Detroit needs young defensive talent to develop if they truly want to reach a Super Bowl. They cannot constantly reset the secondary every time a young player experiences adversity. Terrion Arnold is supposed to be part of the future foundation of this defense, not somebody the organization gives up on after early growing pains. And that is why this entire period feels so important for the Lions. The organization is no longer rebuilding. The expectations are completely different now. Every roster decision is being viewed through the lens of championship contention. Every young player is being evaluated based on whether they can help Detroit finally take the final step. But the biggest question now is whether Brad Holmes and this coaching staff truly have enough young defensive talent already developing inside the building to avoid making desperate trades later in the season, or if another major move is still coming before the Lions fully commit to this roster for a Super Bowl run. What do you think, Lions fans? The pressure surrounding Detroit's defense is becoming impossible to ignore right now, because when you really break down this roster, so much of what happens this season depends on whether these young defensive players finally take that next jump. And that is why the conversations around Terrion Arnold, Jimmy Rolder, Derek Moore, and the entire defensive depth chart are suddenly getting louder during OTAs. Inside the building, the Lions understand something very important that fans are also starting to recognize. The offense is already proven. Jared Goff has shown he can lead this team. Jahmyr Gibbs is one of the most explosive weapons in football. Amon-Ra St. Brown continues to be elite. Sam Laporta became a matchup nightmare almost immediately. The offensive core is not really the concern anymore. The real question is whether the defense can finally become consistent enough for Detroit to survive deep playoff football against elite NFC teams. And honestly, that is why these OTA reports matter way more than people think. Every positive development from a young defender becomes important because Detroit is depending on internal growth more than outside blockbuster moves right now. That is why Jimmy Rolder's early impact is catching attention. The Lions are searching for speed, energy, and physicality at linebacker after losing Alex Anzalone. They do not necessarily need Rolder to become an all-pro immediately, but they absolutely need him to become playable. They need him to contribute. They need him to help stabilize the rotation. And if he develops faster than expected, suddenly Brad Holmes looks even smarter for resisting those aggressive draft day trades. Because think about the alternative for a second. Imagine if Detroit had sacrificed multiple mid-round picks to move up aggressively in the draft. Maybe Derek Moore is gone. Maybe Rolder never becomes a Lion. Maybe the defensive depth looks thin entering camp. Those are the kinds of decisions that can quietly affect an entire season later in the year when injuries start piling up. And Lions fans know injuries became a brutal storyline before. That is why there is such a strong focus now on depth throughout this roster. Detroit understands that championship teams are not just built with stars. They are built with rotational players who can survive the grind of a full NFL season. That is especially true on defense, where injuries can completely destroy momentum if backups are not ready. At the same time, the rumors around Josh Sweat continue creating debate because fans are split right down the middle on the idea. One side looks at Detroit's current window and believes this is the exact moment to go all in. They see Aiden Hutchinson needing another dangerous edge rusher opposite him, and they believe adding someone like Josh Sweat could transform the pass rush overnight. But the other side sees the financial reality that is quickly approaching this organization. This is no longer the old Lions team with unlimited flexibility and no stars to pay. Detroit now has cornerstone players everywhere, and keeping those stars together is going to become extremely expensive very fast. That changes everything about how Brad Holmes must approach trades now compared to a few years ago. Every dollar matters now. Every future draft pick matters now. Every contract extension matters now. Because the moment you start making emotional win-now decisions without protecting the future, things can collapse quickly in the NFL. The Lions are trying to avoid becoming one of those teams that burns through resources chasing one season and then suffers afterward. That is why many fans actually respect the patience Detroit showed during the draft. They explored trades, but they did not panic. They stayed disciplined, and that discipline may have protected the future stability of the roster. Another thing quietly becoming clear is how much trust Brad Holmes has built with this fan base compared to previous front offices. Years ago, Lions fans would immediately panic anytime trade rumors started circulating. Now the reaction feels different. Even when analysts criticize Holmes, many fans immediately defend him because the results have largely justified that trust. And honestly, it is hard to argue against that. This roster transformation did not happen accidentally. Detroit became a contender because Brad Holmes consistently found talent that fit the culture Dan Campbell wanted to build. Tough players, competitive players, players willing to develop, players willing to embrace pressure. That culture shift changed the entire identity of the franchise. But now comes the hardest part of the process: maintaining success once expectations become massive. And that is exactly where Detroit finds itself entering this season. Nobody is sneaking up on anybody anymore. The Lions are no longer the underdog story everybody laughed about years ago. Opposing teams now circle Detroit on the schedule. National media discusses the Lions as a legitimate Super Bowl contender. That changes the pressure completely. Every weakness gets analyzed harder. Every rumor becomes bigger. Every roster move gets dissected across the league, which brings the conversation right back to Terry and Arnold. Because if Arnold develops into the